For a few minutes after that, Sunny was in a dark mood, but then he pulled himself out of it and inhaled deeply, trying to enjoy the fresh air. Indeed, air like that was hard to come by in the real world. Microdust and other pollutants made it rough and unpleasant, not to mention the general stench at the outskirts. In the better parts of the city, sophisticated filtration systems worked diligently. However, filtrated air tasted sterile and stagnant. Only the very rich had access to truly pleasant breathing. And here he was, able to enjoy an unlimited amount of pristine, delicious air, like a second-generation Scheibel. Truly being chosen by the spell has its benefits. If only there was no dreadful cold, and his feet did not ache and his wrist and back were not in agony. The slave caravan slowly drug itself up the mountain, with more and more slaves stumbling and periodically falling to the ground. A couple of times, those who could not walk anymore were taken off the chain and unceremoniously tossed off the road, down into the abyss that loomed to the left of it. Sonny watched them fall with a bit of compassion. Poor fellows, rest in peace, you pitiful souls. All in all, he was in good spirits. It was a bit strange to feel good amidst this disaster of a nightmare, but thankfully Sonny had time to prepare himself for this eventuality. When the symptoms of the spell first appeared, he did not handle it well. Dying before he even turned 17 was not something one could easily cope with. But, in the end, it only took Sonny several days to come to terms with it. After visiting his parents' makeshift resting place, well, actually, since he was too poor to afford even the cheapest slot in the remembrance facility, it was just 2 lines carved into an old tree, and adding a third line for himself, Sonny suddenly felt relaxed and carefree. After all, he didn't have to worry about earning money, finding food, protecting himself, and planning for the future anymore. Once the worst that could happen had already happened, what else was there to fear? So, becoming a slave and slowly freezing to death was not that much of a shock. Besides, he knew that cold wouldn't kill him, simply because he had already seen what fate was awaiting the caravan further up the mountain. The picture of piled bones littering the ground was still fresh in his mind. Most likely, it was a pack of monsters that was going to do the caravan in, and by the look of it, the attack was going to take place in a matter of hours, not days. So he still had a chance. Using the opportunity, Sunny decided to take another look at his status and summon the ruins again. This time, he was too outraged by the aspect and didn't study the attributes well. While not as important as one's aspect, the attributes were often the deciding factor between life and death. They represented one's natural traits and affinities, sometimes even providing passive abilities and effects. Fated, attribute description. The strings of fate wrap tightly around you. Unlikely events, both good and bad, are drawn by your presence. There are those who are blessed, and there are those who are cursed, but rarely both. Mark of Divinity. Attribute description. You bear a faint scent of divinity, as though someone briefly touched by it once, a long time ago. Child of Shadows. Attribute description. Shadows recognize you as one of their own. Interesting. Sonny quickly recognized the first attribute, Fated as the main culprit of his predicament. At first glance, it seemed to indicate that he was destined for a certain fate, to die miserably and vanish without a trace, for example. But after reading the description, he realized that being fated actually just meant that improbable things had a higher chance of occurring when he was around. I guess this is how I managed to receive one of the super rare useless aspects, and a weird variant of it at that. If fated was his innate attribute, then the other two came from the temple slave aspect. Mark of Divinity was more or less straightforward. It was supposed to allow passage into certain sacred places inside the dream realm, and enhance several types of sorcery. Since there was no sacred places in sight, and Sunny's aspect had nothing to do with sorcery, it was useless too. Child of Shadows was a stranger one. He had never heard of it and had no idea what it was supposed to do, at least not until the sun hid behind the mountain and the sky began to darken. To his surprise, Sunny found himself able to see perfectly in the darkness, as though it was still bright as day. This ability alone was nothing to scoff at, and it was quite possible that Shadows would reward him with some other, yet unknown gifts. Finally, something good. I wonder if... Stop the caravan! Prepare to camp! Following the head soldier's orders, the slaves stopped and fell to the ground, shivering and exhausted. The small clearing where the road widened was somewhat protected from the wind by a protruding mass of rock, but it was still too cold to rest with ease. The soldiers got busy herding the slaves into a tight circle, forcing them to share warmth and lighting up a large bonfire in the middle of the camp. Although not before tending to their horses, the heavy wagon carrying food, water, and other cargo to which the main chain was firmly affixed was pushed forward to block the wind. While looking around, Sonny noticed a young soldier from before, watching the mountain with a complicated look on his face. What a weirdo. Soon the bonfire was blazing. The stronger slaves tried to find their way closer to the fire, while the weaker ones, like Sonny, were forced to sit at the outer end of the circle, with their backs freezing in the cold. Of course, any movement was encumbered by the fact that they were still shackled to the chain. That's why the familiar broad-shouldered slave ended up just where he started, despite all of his efforts to get closer to the flame. "Damn Imperials," he hissed, clearly irritated. The soldiers walked among the slaves, giving them water and food. Sonny, just like everyone else, received a few sips of icy water and a small piece of rock-hard moldy bread. Despite its unappetizing look, he forced himself to eat the whole thing, just to be left as hungry as he was before. By the looks of it, he wasn't the only one. The shifty slave that had been walking behind him looked around in anguish. "By the gods, they used to feed me better even in the dungeons!" He spat on the ground, desperate. "And most of us innocent men in the dungeon were there waiting to visit the gallows too." A few steps away from them, where the paved road ended and sharp rocks began, a scattering of bright red berries were glowing from the snow. Sonny had noticed them before, clustering here and there along the road, and even noted how pretty and those resilient things looked, contrasted against the white. The shifty slave's eyes glistened as he tried to crawl towards the berries on all fours. "I would advise against eating those, friend." It was the gentle-voiced slave again. Sonny turned around and finally saw him in the flesh for the first time. It was a tall man in his 40s, lean and strangely handsome with the dignified look of a scholar. How a man such as him ended up as a slave was a mystery. Yet there he was. "You and your advice again. What? Why?" The scholar smiled apologetically. "These berries are called bloodbane. They grow in places where human blood was spilled. That's why there's always a lot of them along the slave trade routes." "So what?" The older man sighed. "Bloodbane is poisonous. A few berries might be enough to kill an adult man." "Curses!" The shifty slave flinched back and glared at the scholar. Sonny did not pay them a lot of attention, because, while looking around, he finally recognized the site of the camp as the place where, in his vision at the start of the nightmare, the bones of the slaves were buried under the snow, and he was willing to bet that whatever it was that was going to kill them all was going to happen soon. As if to answer his thoughts, a thundering noise rang from above, and in the next second, something massive came crashing from the sky. Turning in the direction of the thundering noise, many slaves raised their heads, only to see rocks and heavy shards of ice raining on them from above. They instantly panicked, lurching away in a cacophony of screams. Shadows happily danced on black stones as, entangled by the thick chain, those slaves fell to the ground and pulled others with them. Sonny was one of the few that remained upright, mostly because he was ready for something like this to happen. Calm and collected, he gazed at the night sky, his attribute-enhanced eyes piercing the darkness, and took one measured step back. In the next second, a piece of ice the size of a man's torso hit the ground right in front of him and exploded, showering everything with sharp shards. Others weren't that quick. As ice and stones continued to rain, many were wounded, and a few even lost their lives. Agonizing wails filled the air. "On your feet, fools! Get to the wall!" The veteran soldier, the one who whipped Sonny a few hours before, was shouting angrily, trying to get the slaves to move towards the relative safety of the mountain slope. However, before anyone could heed his command, something massive came crashing down, sending a tremor through the stones beneath their feet. It fell right between the caravan and the mountain wall, plunging everything into silence for a few seconds. At first it looked like a lump of dirty snow, roughly round in shape and as tall as a mounted horseman. However, Once the creature unfurled its long limbs and rose, it towered over the stone platform like a nightmarish omen of death. That thing must be at least 4 meters tall, Sonny thought, a bit stunned. The creature had 2 stumpy legs, an emaciated hunched torso, and disproportionately long multi-jointed hands, 2 of them, each ending with a set of horrifying bone claws, and another 2, these ones shorter, ending with almost human-like fingers. The thing that at first glance looked like dirty snow turned out to be its fur, yellowish-gray and ragged, thick enough to stop arrows and swords. On its head, 5 milky white eyes regarded the slaves with insect-like indifference. Beneath them a terrible maw, crowding with razor-sharp teeth, was half open, as though in anticipation. Viscous drool was running down the creature's chin and dripping into the snow. What unnerved Sonny the most, though, were the strange shapes endlessly moving, worm-like under the creature's skin. He could see them clearly because, unfortunately, he was one of the unlucky souls closest to the monstrosity, getting a nauseating first-row view. Well, that's just too much, he thought, stupefied. As soon as Sonny finished that thought, all hell broke loose. The creature moved, slashing its claws in his general direction, but Sonny was 1 step ahead. Without wasting a single moment, he jumped sideways, as far as the chain allowed, conveniently placing the broad-shouldered slave between him and the monster. His quick reaction saved his life, as those sharp claws, each as long as a sword, slashed through the broad-shouldered man a fraction of a second later and sent streams of blood flying through the air. Drenched in the hot liquid, Sonny hit the ground, and his fellow slave, now simply a corpse, fell on him from above. "Damn, why are you so heavy?" Temporarily blinded, Sonny heard a chilling howl and felt an enormous shadow passing over him. Immediately after, a deafening chorus of screams filled the night. Not paying it any attention, he tried to roll the corpse to the side, but was stopped by a forceful lurch of the chain that twisted his wrist and filled his mind with white-hot pain. Disoriented, he felt himself being dragged a few steps, but then the chain suddenly slackened, and he was able to control his hands again. See? Things could have been worse. Putting his palm against the dead man's chest, he pushed with all the strength he had. The heavy corpse stubbornly resisted all of his attempts, but then finally fell sideways, setting Sonny free. However, he didn't get to celebrate this newly found freedom, as his blood suddenly turned to ice. Because at that moment, with his palm still pressed against the broad-shouldered slave's bleeding body, he clearly felt something wiggling under the dead man's skin. "You just had to think about how things get worse, right? You idiot!" he thought, then flinched back. Pushing the corpse with his legs, Sonny crawled as far away from it as he could, which is about 1.5 meters, thanks to the ever-present chain. He quickly glanced around, noticing a mass of dancing shadows and a silhouette of a monster rampaging amidst the screaming slaves on the opposite end of the stone platform. Then he concentrated on the dead body, which was starting to convulse with growing violence. On the opposite side of the corpse, the shifty slave was looking at it with slackened jaw and a horrified expression on his face. Sonny waved to get his attention. "What are you staring at? Move away from it!" The shifty slave tried, but immediately fell down. The chain was twisted between the 3 of them, pinned down under by the broad-shouldered man's weight. Sonny clenched his teeth. Right under his eyes, the corpse was going through a nightmare-inducing metamorphose. Strange bone growths pierced its skin, extending like spikes. The muscle bulged and wriggled, as though trying to change shape. The fingernails were turning into sharp claws. The face cracked and split, bearing an open, twisted mouth with one too many rows of bloodied, needle-like fangs. This is not right. Sonny twitched, feeling a strong urge to empty his stomach. The chain! The scholarly slave was just a few steps behind the shifty one, pointing at his shackles with a face as pale as a ghost. That remark was far from helpful, but given the circumstances, his shock was understandable. Being shackled was bad enough, but being shackled to such horror was truly unfair. But Sonny's conclusion that things weren't right did not come from self-pity. He just meant that his whole situation was literally not right. The spell, mysterious as it was, had its own set of rules. There were rules for what type of creatures could appear in any given nightmare, too. The nightmare creature had their own hierarchy, from mindless beasts to monsters, followed by demons, devils, tyrants, terrors, and finally mythical titans, also known as calamities. The first nightmare was almost always populated by beasts and monsters, rarely a demon mixed in, and Sunny had never ever heard about anything stronger than a single devil appearing in it. However, the creature had clearly just created a lesser version of itself, an ability that belonged exclusively to tyrants, the sovereigns of the nightmare spell, and those above them. What was the tyrant even doing in the first nightmare? How powerful was that damn fated attribute? But there was no time to ponder. Unfair or not, there was only one person now who could save Sunny. Himself. The broad-shouldered man, what was left of him, slowly rose, his mouth producing strange clicking noises. Without giving him time to fully come to his senses, Sunny cursed and jumped forward, grabbing onto the length of the slackened chain. One arm of the monster, now fully equipped with 5 jagged claws, shot forward to meet him, but Sunny sidestepped it with one calculated movement. What saved his skin this time was not his quick reaction, but simple presence of mind. Sunny might not have learned any fancy combat techniques, since his childhood was spent on the streets instead of a school, but the streets, too, were a kind of teacher. He had spent his whole life fighting for survival, quite often literally. That experience allowed him to keep a cool head on his shoulders in the midst of any conflict. So instead of freezing or being consumed by fear and doubt, Sunny just acted. Stepping close, he threw the chain around the monster's shoulders and pulled, pinning its hand to its body. Before the creature, still slow and groggy from its transformation, could properly react, Sunny wrapped the chain around it several times, barely saving his face from being bitten off by the creature's terrifying maw. The good thing was the monster couldn't even move its hands now. The bad thing was, the length of the chain he used to immobilize it was gone, leaving almost no distance between them. "You two!" Sunny screamed, addressing his 2 fellow slaves. "Pull on that chain as though your lives depend on it." Because they were. The shifty slave and the scholar gaped at him and then, understanding what he was thinking, started to move. Grabbing the chain from the opposite directions, they pulled as hard as they could, tightening its grip on the monster and not letting it shake loose. "Great!" Sunny thought. The monster bulged its muscles, trying to break free. The chain creaked, caught on the bone spikes, as though slowly breaking apart. Not so great. Without wasting any more time, he threw his hands in the air and caught the creature's neck with the short, thinner chain connecting his shackles together. Then he circled the monster with a quick step and pulled, ending up back to back with it, as far away from its maw as he could. Sunny knew that he wasn't strong enough to strangle a man with his bare hands, let alone a weird, terrifying mutant like the one trying to eat him. But now, using his own back as a lever and the weight of his whole body to pull the shackles down, he at least stood a chance. He pulled down with all of his might, feeling the monster's body pressing against him, bone spikes brushing against his skin. The monster continued to struggle, clicking loudly and trying to break the chain tying him down apart. Now it's just a question of what would break first, the chain or the monster itself. "Die! Die! Die, you bastard!" Sweat and blood were rolling down Sunny's face as he was pulling and pulling and pulling down with as much force as he could muster. Every second felt like an eternity. His strength and stamina, what little he had to begin with, were quickly running out. His wounded back, wrists, and muscles pierced by the bone spikes were in agony. Then finally, Sunny felt the monster's body go limp. A moment later, a faintly familiar voice rang in the air. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. "You have slain a dormant beast, Mountain King's larva." You have slain a dormant beast, Mountain King's larva. Sunny fell to his knees, breathless. His whole body felt as though it just went through a meat grinder. Even large amounts of adrenaline could not wash away all the pain and exhaustion. And yet he was exhilarated. The satisfaction of killing the larva was so vast that he even forgot to be disappointed about not receiving a memory, the special item tied to a dream realm inhabitant's essence, which was sometimes awarded by the spell to the triumphant awakened. A magic sword or a suit of armor would have come in handy right about now. Damn, he would even settle for a warm coat. 3 seconds. You can rest for 3 more seconds, Sonny thought. After all, the nightmare was far from over. A few moments later, he forced himself to come back to his senses and looked around, trying to ascertain the situation. The larva was dead, which was great. However, he was still tied to it by the damn chain. The shifty slave and the scholar, both pale as death, were busy untangling it to buy the three of them at least some freedom of movement. Further away, torn bodies and pieces of flesh were lying on the ground. Many slaves were killed. A few had somehow managed to escape and were now running away. Fools. They're dooming themselves. The chain, as it turns out, was at some point broken in two. That's why it suddenly slackened when Sonny was being dragged by the mass of panicking slaves. If their shackles had a less sophisticated locking mechanism, he could have tried to free himself now. However, each pair was fixed to a specific link. Without unlocking them, no one was going anywhere. The tyrant, Mountain King presumably, was hidden by sight by the bright glow of the bonfire. However, Sonny could feel its movements due to the subtle tremors spreading through the stones, as well as the desperate screams of those slaves who have yet to perish. An angry bellow or two could also be heard, indicating that some of the soldiers were still alive, desperately trying to fight the monstrosity off. What pulled his attention the most, though, was the fact that several of the main bodies were starting to move. More larvae? His eyes opened. One after another, 4 more corpses slowly rose to their feet. Each beast looked as disgusting as the first one had, and not a bit less deadly. The nearest was mere meters away from Sonny. Damn it all, he thought, and then weakly, I want to wake up. As strange clicking filled the air, one of the beasts turned its head toward the 3 slaves and gnashed its fangs. Shifty fell on his ass, whispering a prayer, while Scholar just froze in place. Sonny's eyes darted to the ground, trying to find something to use as a weapon, but there was not a single thing he could use. Full of vitriol, he simply warped a length of chain around the knuckles and raised his fist. Come at me, you bastards! The larva dashed forward with incredible speed in a flurry of claws, fangs, and terror. Sonny had less than a second to react. However, before he could do anything, a nimble figure moved past him, and a sharp sword flashed in the air. The monster, beheaded with one strike, fell graciously on the ground. Sonny blinked. What was that? Dumbfounded, he slowly turned his head and looked to his left. Standing there with a valorous expression was the handsome young soldier who had once offered him water. He looked calm and collected, if a little grim. There was not a speck of dirt or blood on his leather armor. He is awesome, Sonny thought before catching himself. Poser! He's a poser! With a short nod, the soldier moved forward to face the remaining 3 larvae. But after taking a few steps, he suddenly turned around and gave Sonny a long look. Then, with one swift motion, the young warrior took something from his belt and threw it to Sonny. Save yourself! With that, he was gone to fight the monsters. Sonny reflexively caught the item and watched the soldier go. Then he lowered his gaze and studied the thing clutched tightly in his hands. It was a short and narrow iron rod with a straight bend on its end. A key. It's a key! His heart began to beat faster. It's the key to the shackles! With one last glance at the fierce battle starting between the young soldier and the larva, Sonny dropped on one knee and began to maneuver the shackles, trying to get his hand into a suitable position to insert the key. It took him a few tries to understand how the unfamiliar lock worked. But then finally there was a satisfying click, and he was suddenly free. The cold wind caressed his bloodied wrist. Sonny rubbed them and smiled with a dark gleam in his eyes. Just you wait now. For a moment, visions of violence and revenge filled his head. Boy, over here! Shifty was waving his hands in the air, trying to get his attention. Sonny briefly considered just leaving him to die, but then decided against it. There was strength in numbers. Plus, despite Shifty's previous threats to kill him and overall unpleasantries, Sonny would have felt bad leaving a fellow slave in chains, especially since freeing him would not cost anything. He hurried over to the other 2 slaves and quickly unlocked their shackles. As soon as Shifty was free, he pushed Sonny away and did a little dance, laughing like a maniac. "Ha ha! Free at last! Gods must be smiling upon us!" Scholar was more reserved. He squeezed Sonny's shoulder in gratitude and smiled weakly, casting a tense look in the direction of the ensuing fight. Two of the three larvae was already dead. The third one was missing an arm, but still trying to tear its opponent apart. The young soldier danced around it, moving with the graceful fluidity of a natural-born warrior. "What are you waiting for? Run!" Shifty made a move to run away, but was stopped by the scholar. "My friend, I would—" "If you say advise again, I swear to gods I'll bash your head open." The two slaves looked at each other with open animosity. A moment later, Scholar lowered his eyes and sighed. "If we run away now, we will surely die." "Why?" The older slave simply pointed at the tall bonfire. "Because without that fire, we will freeze to death before the night is over. Until the sun rises, running away is suicide." Sonny did not say anything, knowing that the scholar was right. Actually, he realized it right after strangling the larva. No matter how terrible Mountain King was, the bonfire was still their only lifeline in this frozen hell. It was just as the broad-shouldered slave, may he rest in peace, had said. There was no need for anyone to kill them, because the mountain itself would do it, too, if given the chance. "So what? I prefer freezing to death than being eaten by that monster anyway. Not to mention, turning into one of those things." Shifty was pretending to be brave, but there was no conviction in his voice. Glanced at the darkness surrounding the stone platform, and shivered before taking a step back. At this point the third larva was long dead, and the young soldier was nowhere to be seen. He had probably gone to join the fight at the other side of the bonfire, leaving the three other slaves alone at the mountainside part of the stone platform. Scholar cleared his throat. The monster might be satiated with those it had already slain. It might be defeated or driven away by the Imperials. In any case, if we stay here, we have a chance to survive, however small. But if we run away, our doom will be certain. So what do we do? Unlike Scholar, Sonny was sure the Mountain King would not be satisfied with killing just most of the slaves. Neither did he believe that a bunch of mortals would really be able to defeat it. Even if they were not normal people but awakened, a fight with a tyrant was not something one could easily survive, let alone win. But if he wanted to live, he had to get rid of that thing somehow. "Let's go take a look." Shifty looked at him as though seeing a lunatic. "Are you insane? You want to get closer to that beast?" Sonny stared at him blankly, then shrugged and headed in the direction of the rampaging monster.